Welcome to EchoVerse Whispers, where the veil between sleep and shadow thins, and stories are sung rather than told. In this series, every night, something sings under my bed. We invite you into a haunting symphony of dreams and dread. 15 parts of supernatural horror designed not to startle you awake, but to lull you into slumber with one eye open. These aren't just stories, they're lullabies stitched with fear, woven from memory, and humming beneath your bed. So dim the lights. Tuck yourself in, and listen closely. The night remembers. And now, so will you. I first heard it on a Wednesday, which I remember not because of anything remarkable about the day but because of how unremarkable everything else was. How perfectly dull the hours had passed until that moment in the quiet of night when I laid in bed with my phone face down on the nightstand and the room soaked in darkness. The only sound, the humming of the ceiling fan overhead until something else joined it. A soft melodic tune rising up from beneath my bed like someone singing to themselves just below my mattress. The kind of distant, airy song you might expect from a lullaby etched into a music box left too long in the attic. But this wasn't mechanical, it was human, feminine, old and weathered yet hauntingly sweet, almost like a nursery rhyme whispered through layers of sleep. And at first I thought maybe it was a neighbor or the TV left on in the apartment above me until I realized I lived on the top floor and my neighbors on either side were either on vacation or had moved out weeks ago, which meant the song had to be coming from inside my apartment. More specifically from the narrow shadowed gap between my floor and the underside of my bed, where no one should be. And yet there it was again, a soft hum following the same pattern of notes, looping every 10 seconds or so, barely audible but unmistakably intentional, and I lay there frozen, my eyes straining against the dark, heart thudding in that quiet way when you're scared but unsure if you should be, and I told myself it had to be something explainable, a draft, a trick of the ears. An echo from the hallway, but then came the pause, a silence that dragged a little longer than it should have. Like whoever, or whatever was singing, had noticed me noticing. And I felt a sudden shift in the air. Not a breeze, but a presence. The thick sensation of not being alone, even though I hadn't heard a door open, or the floor creak. And that's when the whisper came, soft as breath. Just one word spoken like a secret sliding under the blanket of night. Listen, it said, and I sat upright so fast I nearly rolled off the bed, fumbling for my lamp and nearly knocking it over before the bulb finally warmed to life and flooded the room with pale yellow light that chased away the shadows but not the feeling. That thick, suffocating feeling of something still there, watching, waiting, hiding just out of sight. And when I leaned over to peer beneath the bed, all I saw was dust, and the crumpled hoodie I'd been too lazy to pick up. No sign of anyone, no sign of anything, and yet the sound had been real, the voice had been real. And I told myself maybe I had fallen asleep and dreamed it, that maybe it was sleep paralysis even though I had moved and sat up and felt everything. And so I left the light on and pulled the covers tight and didn't sleep until morning began. Bleeding through the blinds and the ordinary world resumed. Chasing the nightmare back under the bed or into whatever dark pocket it had come from, but the next night it returned, and this time I was ready. Lying in wait with the lamp off and a flashlight in my hand, my phone set to record just in case. And sure enough, around 2:14 a.m., the singing began, the same fragile melody rising from beneath me, almost inviting in its gentleness. And I felt the hair on my arms rise as I stared at the ceiling and listened to it unfold again, and this time I counted, noted the rhythm. The slight catch in the voice at the end of each loop, like someone tired of singing the same tune again and again, and then it stopped, mid-note cut off like a record needle scratched across a vinyl. And I held my breath as silence took over and the flashlight shook slightly in my hand. And then came the same whisper, this time closer, clearer. As though lips pressed against the mattress itself to speak through it. Listen. It said again, the same voice. And I jolted up, flicked on the flashlight. And again saw nothing beneath the bed but dust and fabric. No trace of movement or sound, just the eerie stillness of a room that should have been empty. And yet, I felt watched, deeply and personally observed, like something unseen had been measuring me, weighing my reactions. And when I played back the recording, the audio was blank, no hum, no voice. Only the sound of my own breathing, and the distant buzz of electricity, which made it worse. Made it feel as if whatever it was could choose what got recorded and what didn't. As if it had rules I didn't understand, and over the following nights, it became a pattern, a ritual I couldn't control. At 2:14, the singing would begin, the same song, looping like a broken child's lullaby. Always from beneath the bed, never louder than a whisper, but always just clear enough to make out the melody. And sometimes it would speak the word again, listen, as if pleading with me, or warning me, or simply marking me, and each morning, I would wake up more tired, more frayed at the edges, feeling as though sleep was no longer a place of rest, but a hunting ground. And I tried everything: white noise, staying at a friend's, even moving my mattress to the living room floor, but no matter where I went. At 2:14 a.m., the voice returned, now no longer needing the bed, now finding me wherever I chose to sleep. And the song began to change subtly, shifting keys, adding faint discordant notes that made my skin crawl. And one night it sang my name at the end of a verse. Soft and trembling, like it was afraid to say it, or maybe excited, and I leaped out of bed, flipped every light on, searched every inch of the apartment and found nothing. Not a sign of intrusion or tampering, but I knew it was real. I knew it was something ancient and deliberate. And it wasn't until I noticed the dark stain forming slowly on the underside of the mattress, like ink bleeding up from below, that I finally called someone, my sister, who believed in spirits, who said the words veil in thin places and haunting with a certainty I couldn't match. And she offered to stay over, to see it for herself, and the night she did. The song came, as always, at 2:14. But this time, there was something else, a second voice, deeper, groaning, not in tune, but trying to be. Like it was mimicking the song without knowing how, and my sister sat bolt upright and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, whispering, "You didn't tell me there were two." And I felt ice crawl down my spine, as the harmony broke into a discordant cacophony, like something struggling to emerge. And then it all stopped. Just like that, both voices cutting off mid-phrase, and something knocked once, just once, from beneath the floorboards, and in that silence, my sister grabbed my arm and said, "We need to find out what's buried under this building." And I knew then, that whatever had been singing wasn't just haunting me, it was waking up. After that night with my sister, the one where two voices tried to sing in imperfect harmony beneath us, something shifted permanently. Not just in the apartment, but in me, like a thread had been pulled from the very fabric of reality, and now everything was unraveling slowly around it. And even though it was daylight when she said goodbye, I saw the unease etched in her face. The way she lingered at the door, and kept glancing back like she expected something to follow her out. And I didn't tell her that it did. That the singing didn't stop that morning like it usually did, but instead kept going in small, soft gasps. As if whoever, or whatever was beneath the bed, had realized it didn't need night anymore. And the next night it began earlier, 1:48 a.m. And it didn't start with the song this time, but with a low humming that vibrated through the springs of the mattress, like a tuning fork, held just beneath my spine. And when I pressed my ear against the sheets, I heard what I thought were words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but something rhythmic and chanted like a prayer or a summons. And I jumped back as if burned, because for the first time, I felt heat coming from below. Like the breath of something large, exhaling from under the floor. And I didn't sleep after that. Just sat in the hallway, staring at the door to my bedroom. Waiting for something to change, and it did, though. Not how I expected. Because when the sun rose, I opened the bedroom door, and found a single red thread, curled on the floor. Stretched taut between the closet and the bed. Like someone had been weaving something while I wasn't looking, and the worst part was that I followed it on hands and knees and found it tied in a small knot beneath the bed frame, hanging down just slightly into the shadows like a lure or a warning. And I grabbed it with trembling fingers and pulled, but it didn't give, didn't stretch or snap, it just held firm, as if anchored in something far heavier than the frame. Something rooted in a place deeper than my floorboards, and I left it there. Didn't dare to cut it, didn't know what cutting it might do. And when I stepped back out into the hall, I realized the lights were dimmer than usual, that the hallway bulb was flickering even though it had been brand new, and when I looked in the mirror that morning, I thought I saw something behind me. Not a figure exactly, but a smudge of darkness that moved against the corner of the frame like a thought. Not meant to be seen. And when I turned around, nothing was there. Of course, nothing ever is when you check. And still, I kept seeing the red thread in my mind. Dreaming about it without sleeping, hallucinating it trailing across the kitchen floor or wrapped around my ankles when I showered. And I started researching the building. Something my sister had told me to do in her urgent, whispery voice. And at first, there was nothing, just your average apartment block, built in the 70s. Remodeled twice, the kind of place that wasn't old enough to be mysterious, and not new enough to be safe. But then, I found an article from a microfiche scan buried in the local library archives. A small piece about a townhouse that once stood on this very lot. Burned down in 1952 under mysterious circumstances. 3 fatalities, all children, and I felt cold when I read it, not because of what was written but because of what wasn't. The names were redacted, the cause undetermined. And in the grainy black and white photo of the ruins, I could just make out the frame of a narrow bed, sticking up through the ash. The kind with wrought-iron rails and a threadbare mattress. And in the center of the bed was something else. Something I couldn't identify at first, until I squinted and realized it was a small doll. Head turned slightly, mouth open as if in mid-song, and the caption said items recovered from fire. Owners unknown. And I took a picture of the article and sent it to my sister. But she didn't respond for hours, and when she finally did, her message just said, "That's not a doll, that's a corpse." And my blood froze because I had stared at it for so long trying to identify it, and had never once considered that, but once she said it, I couldn't unsee it, the small limbs, the twisted mouth, the hollow eye sockets. And that night, I didn't go home. I slept at a hotel, or at least tried to. But at exactly 2:14 a.m., the wall behind my head began to thrum, with that same lullaby melody. Not loud but clear, like someone playing it on the other side of the drywall. And I knew it had followed me, not just the voice or the sound, but the presence, and I turned on all the lights and called my sister again. And this time she answered on the first ring and said she'd been dreaming of red thread. That it was wrapped around her hands and pulling her into the floor, and I told her everything, about the fire, the photo, the humming at the hotel, and she was silent for a long moment before saying, "It's not just haunting you, it's choosing you." And I asked what that meant, but she didn't know. Just said she was coming back with something. Some old tools from our grandmother's attic. Things she said were meant for binding spirits, or at least keeping them from slipping through too easily. And I didn't believe in any of it fully. But I didn't disbelieve either, not anymore, not with the nightly chorus, and the feeling of eyes always watching from beneath the mattress. And so I waited for her, paced the apartment with the windows open and every light on, and when she finally arrived with a satchel of herbs, chalk, and tiny iron nails, I let her do whatever she wanted, even when it felt ridiculous. Even when she made me draw symbols and salt across the doorways and sleep with crushed mint leaves under my pillow. But that night, something new happened at 2:14 a.m. The song didn't begin, and for a moment I thought it was over. That her rituals had worked. But then came a scratching, slow and deliberate. From the underside of the bed, like nails dragged across old wood, and then a knock, one, then two, then five in total. Evenly spaced and patient, and I didn't have to look at my sister to know she'd heard it too. And she whispered, "Don't answer it," which chilled me more than anything. Because she said it like she'd said it before. Like it was something she'd been taught, or had once learned the hard way. And the knocking didn't repeat, didn't insist, it just stopped. And the room grew so cold that our breath clouded in the air. And in the fog of that breath, I saw something move, a shape beneath the covers, like a hand reaching up through the mattress, and then the singing resumed, but not below this time. It came from the ceiling, from the overhead light fixture, from the walls themselves. Like the entire room had become an instrument, and we were inside the song, trapped in its rhythm, and the melody was deeper now, less lullaby and more lament. A grieving tune that scraped the soul. And I could see tears on my sister's cheeks without knowing she'd begun to cry, and then I felt it again, that same thick presence settling over us like a fog, and I realized it wasn't just singing to be heard, it was singing because it was lonely. Because it remembered something we'd all forgotten, and I asked my sister softly, "What does it want?" And she didn't answer right away, just stared toward the bed and finally whispered, "A name." It's singing because it has no name, and something about that made perfect sense. Some ancient instinct in me recognizing the truth of it, because names are powerful, and names are binding, and if something dies nameless, it wanders, and maybe that's all this was, a wandering song. A restless echo, looking for its shape, and that night we stayed awake, until dawn. And when the sun rose, I found the red thread again, now looped gently around the bedpost, tied in a bow like a gift, and beside it, burned faintly into the wood, was a word. One I didn't recognize but knew wasn't written by any hand I knew, and I felt then that things were just beginning. That the singing wasn't the story, it was the invitation. The word etched into the bedpost stayed with me long after my sister had gone. A curling series of symbols that didn't belong to any language I knew, Yet every time I looked at them, they stirred something ancient in the back of my mind, like an echo of a memory that wasn't mine. And I found myself sketching them in the margins of notebooks, tracing them with my finger on steamed mirrors, seeing them in the patterns of cracked paint and spilled coffee, and I knew then that the presence sought was not a name like ours, not Sarah, or James, or Benjamin, but something older, something closer to a binding or an anchor. And the red thread tied to my bedpost had begun to spread, one strand at first, trailing across the room to the far wall, another creeping along the floorboards toward the closet, thin and soft yet impossibly strong, resisting scissors and flame, reacting only to silence, as if sound gave it power and quiet weakened it. And so I tried to be quiet, kept the apartment noiseless after dark, muted the TV, turned my phone on airplane mode, wore socks to keep my footsteps muffled, and for a few days the song didn't come, though I could feel it waiting, like a breath held beneath the floorboards, aching to exhale, and the silence became unbearable, like it was pressing against my ears from the inside out. And on the fourth night of this stillness, the red thread began to vibrate softly, pulsing in rhythm, to something I couldn't hear, but could feel in my teeth and bones. And then it happened at 2:14 a.m., exactly. A whisper came from inside my closet. Not the word listen this time, but a sound like humming reversed, as though someone were trying to drag a lullaby backward through time. And I watched as the closet door creaked open on its own, slow and steady, revealing nothing but shadows and clothing, and the long, unmoving stretch of thread that now coiled up the inner frame like ivy. And I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared, until I saw something move, a slight, jerky twitch of the lowest hanger, as though a hand had brushed against it from inside the wall. And then the singing resumed, but it wasn't beneath the bed anymore. It was everywhere, inside the walls, behind the closet, under the sink, humming out of the vents and radiators, and even the silent mouth of my unplugged speaker, all singing the same distorted melody in perfect dissonance, like a choir that had forgotten how to grieve and could only mimic the shape of sorrow. And I ran then, fled into the stairwell barefoot, heart hammering, not caring who saw me or how I looked. And I ended up outside in the summer night air, gasping, shaking, feeling the residual notes of the song sliding off my skin like sweat. And I didn't go back until the sun was rising and the birds had begun to sing. And when I opened the door, I smelled something sweet and wrong, like overripe fruit rotting in an enclosed space. And I followed it to the bedroom, where the bed had been moved, not completely, but enough to show scrape marks on the floor, where something large and heavy had pushed it aside. And beneath it, a single black feather lay coiled like a dead insect, shiny and smooth and wet to the touch. And I picked it up before I could think better of it, held it in my hand and felt a pulse, faint but definite, like the beat of a second heart. And I dropped it immediately, wiped my palm against my pants, and heard something laugh from under the floor. A single amused exhale, like someone watching a game unfold exactly how they'd planned. And I called my sister again, begged her to come, but she didn't answer, and I sent texts, voicemails, even showed up at her place the next morning. But her car was gone and her phone went straight to voicemail. And it wasn't until the next night that I heard from her again, not with a call or a message, but with her voice joining the others in the song, her tone unmistakable, soft and cracked, humming the same ancient tune beneath my bed at exactly 2:14 a.m., and I screamed her name, flipped the bed, tore at the red thread, now routed into the wood and floor like veins, and cried until I collapsed on the floor. And when I awoke, the thread was gone, the song was gone. But her voice echoed faintly in my mind like the memory of a lullaby heard in the womb, and I knew then that it had taken her, pulled her through whatever breach existed beneath that bed, dragged her into the place where that tune was born, and I couldn't follow, not yet, not without understanding. And so I began to dig, not into the floor, not yet, but into history, into the town's records. Old maps, strange folklore forums, and I learned about the hollowing. A term whispered among old locals and dismissed by most as urban legend, the story of a place where sound thins the veil between worlds, where lullabies are not meant to soothe but to summon, where children vanished in their sleep without a trace for decades. Before the townhouse fire in 1952 marked the last of the disappearances, and the survivors who remembered never spoke openly, only left behind fragments in journals, phrases like "the ones beneath" and "singing mouths in the dark," and one line scratched into the wood of an attic rafter I found through a forgotten blog archive. "Don't hum at night if they hear you. They think you're one of them." And I realized I had been humming, not loudly, but often, in the bathroom, while cooking, even nervously under my breath when the singing began. And maybe that was why it had chosen me, why it had mistaken me for something else, or maybe not mistaken at all. Maybe it knew I was just hollow enough to be filled, and I returned to the apartment with a plan: record the song, isolate the melody, try to understand the pattern, find meaning in the notes, and so I set up microphones, devices on every side of the bed, the closet, the bathroom, and waited in the dark, eyes closed, breath shallow, and when 2:14 a.m. struck, the singing began again, this time slower, sadder, like it was mourning something it had already consumed. And the feather I'd left on the shelf began to tremble, to vibrate with the rhythm of the song, and then a voice not my sister's this time, but a new one, lower, male, rough and distant, whispered, "She's still singing, but not for you." And I opened my eyes and saw movement in the shadows near the closet, the red thread emerging again like a slow serpent, slithering across the floor toward me. And I stood frozen as it reached my toes and curled around my left ankle. Not pulling, just resting there, pulsing like a living thing. And I whispered her name, my sister's name, and the singing stopped instantly. The thread twitched, and then the voice returned, louder now, overlapping hers and the others in a horrible duet, saying again, "Not for you, not anymore," and then silence fell so hard I could hear my heartbeat slamming in my ears, and I ran to my equipment, stopped the recordings, and played them back. And for the first time there was something audio, real and raw, the sound of the song in full. A dozen voices, layered and weeping, rising and falling in broken harmonies. And beneath it, faintly but undeniably, my name, spoken again and again in a chant. "He listens, he listens, he listens." And I deleted the file, burned the recorder. But the sound didn't leave me. It lived in my skull now, a tune I couldn't forget. And I knew then I had to go deeper, had to open the floor, see what lay beneath, and so I pried up the boards one by one, found more thread, more feathers, and something else to bones, small and pale, child-sized, curled around a rusted tin music box that still played a warped version of the lullaby I now hated with every cell of my being, and when I turned the crank, the melody played backward on its own, and the air around me rippled, and the bed began to sing again. Not from beneath, but from within, as though the mattress itself had grown lungs. And I screamed and threw the box across the room. And it landed with a soft thud against the wall, where the red thread had already begun to form words again, new ones, burning themselves into the paint, this time in English. One more song, and we will rise. The words "one more song, and we will rise" stayed burned into my wall for 2 full days, even after I scrubbed at the paint until my fingers bled, even after I tried to cover it with posters, towels, and shelves stacked with books and boxes, to hide the thing that now pulsed faintly through the plaster like it had veins of its own. And I could feel the presence behind the wall. Not just inside the room, but within the very architecture of the building, like it had rooted itself into the bones of the structure, and was now growing outward with each night's melody. And the strangest part was that I stopped being afraid in the traditional sense and began to feel something else. Something worse, a terrible, quiet curiosity. The kind that makes you lean closer to the fire even though you know it will burn. And I began tracing the rhythm of the songs when they came at night, letting them soak into me until I could hum them back without even thinking, until I began to anticipate them, and I hated myself for that. Hated the way my mind started to fill in the harmony before the first note even sounded. And on the 4th night after I found the music box, the voices changed again, not in tone but in arrangement, forming a pattern I could almost see. Like they were singing, not just a song, but a message, a shape, a command in melodic code. And that night I dreamed of an open mouth beneath the bed, impossibly wide and filled with rows of teeth that were not teeth but tiny hands clapping in rhythm with the song. And when I awoke, my pillow was damp and warm, and I was certain someone or something had been sitting on my chest for hours, just watching me, waiting for my eyes to open. And the red thread had now begun creeping up the walls, braiding itself into strange loops and spirals that didn't make sense to my waking mind but made perfect sense to the part of me that had begun to listen too long and too deeply. And my sister was still gone, her phone still dead, her apartment locked from the inside and filled with feathers and salt circles half drawn and candles melted into pools of wax shaped like ears and mouths and clawed hands. And the neighbors had begun to avoid me, eyes flicking past mine in the hallway. One old man pressing a wrinkled note into my palm without a word and walking away. And when I unfolded it, I found a charcoal sketch of my building with the top floors missing and smoke rising from the ground. Children drawn in crude, looping spirals, hovering above the roof like balloons made of shadow. And beneath it were the words they sang first, written 3 times in tiny handwriting. And I began to wonder if everyone who had ever lived here had heard it too. If maybe we were all part of the song now, just notes waiting to be played in the right order. And I decided I had to go beneath, into the crawl space, even if it meant breaking through concrete. Because whatever lived under the bed didn't live under the bed anymore, it lived everywhere. And still it sang as if trapped, begging or threatening or rejoicing, I couldn't tell anymore. And so I waited until nightfall, and then used a crowbar to tear through the boards in the corner of the room where the song always felt strongest. And beneath them was another layer of wood, older, cracked and charred. And beneath that, a hatch I'd never known was there, hidden beneath dust and insulation and the broken shards of a mirror. And when I opened it, I smelled something ancient and sweet and dead, and a cold wind exhaled upward like a sigh that had waited 50 years to escape. and I climbed down with nothing but a flashlight and a recording device strapped to my chest. And the descent was longer than it should have been. The ladder stretching down into darkness until the light above became a memory, and the song below became thunder, and the walls were pulsing with thread, thick cords of it that clung to my arms and brushed against my neck like the strands of a spider's web woven by something that had hands instead of legs. And at the bottom was a room, circular and impossibly wide, with a bed in the center far too large for any human body. Its frame carved from blackened wood that glistened with moisture, and something darker. And the mattress was made of feathers, stitched together with thread that moved on its own, twitching gently like it had nerves. And around the bed were dolls. Hundreds of them, each one face down, their backs sewn shut, and every few seconds, one of them would hum a single note in a soft, breathy voice that shouldn't have come from cotton and plastic. And as I walked closer, the song rose to meet me, the harmony returning in waves that shook the bones of the room, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. The singing wasn't trying to wake up what was under the bed, it was what was under the bed. The song itself, a being, a consciousness, an entity made of echo and memory and grief. And it had no body, no face, just this melody, this endless, looping lament that needed a new voice to carry it. And the moment I stepped within the circle of the bed, I heard them all, my sister, the children, others I didn't know, all of them humming now in unison, and the bed shifted slightly, exhaling a low moan that smelled like soil and blood, and then the floor beneath me dropped, just a few inches, but enough to make me stumble, and when I looked down, I saw my feet submerged in a shallow pool of dark liquid that rippled in time with the music, and from that pool rose more thread, wrapping around my ankles, coiling slowly like a petal unfolding, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe as the air thickened into music. And then I saw her, my sister, crawling from the far wall, her body made of shadow and red string and ash, her face still hers, but eyes hollow. And she whispered without sound, mouthing the words, "Let it finish," and I understood then that the song needed a final verse, a closing stanza, something only I could give. And as the bed opened its mouth, not a real mouth but a gaping space in the mattress where the fabric peeled back and revealed nothing but smoke and teeth and spinning black thread, I felt myself pulled forward. Not physically, but mentally, spiritually, like my thoughts were being unraveled. My memories turned into notes, and I felt a great calm, like the kind that comes before death or birth. And I reached for the recorder, hit play, and let it broadcast the song outward, hoping that maybe if I gave it to the world, it would stop needing me. But the moment the recording echoed in the chamber, everything changed. The thread recoiled, the bed screamed, the dolls lifted their heads and cried in voices that shattered my ears, and the song warped into a howl, a dirge so loud it split the ground. And I was thrown backward against the wall as the chamber began to collapse in on itself. The song folding and folding like a dying star collapsing into silence. And the last thing I saw before the hatch above sealed itself with a slam, was my sister's hand reaching for mine, not to save me, but to hold me steady. And then everything went quiet, not just silent, but empty, like the world had been turned off. And I woke up back in my room, lying on the bed. The red thread gone, the walls blank, the mattress cold and still, and when I looked at the clock, it was 2:15 a.m., and nothing was singing, not above, not below, not within. For 3 nights, there was nothing, no song, no whispers, No scratching beneath the bed or thread creeping along the floorboards. Only silence, pure and absolute. And yet it was not comforting. Not restful, because it felt hollow, like something that had been pulled out rather than resolved. Like the space the song had once filled was now aching in its absence, and I knew better than to trust it. Knew in my bones that quiet was not the same as peace. That absence was not the same as safety, and during those 3 nights I barely slept, lying awake with my eyes on the ceiling, waiting for the melody to return, half hoping it would, because this new emptiness felt unnatural. And I began to notice other things, small things at first. Like how the shadows in the room didn't move when I shifted the lamp. Or how mirrors no longer reflected light the right way. Or how my reflection blinked a second too late. As if it were learning. And on the 4th morning, I awoke to find that my feet were dirty, covered in black dust, like I'd been walking barefoot through coal ash. Though I hadn't left my bed, and the carpet beneath the bed was wet, not soaked, but damp enough to leave stains on the soles of my feet, and when I lifted the mattress to check again, I found only wood, dust, and a single white feather laid perfectly in the center of the floor, and I didn't touch it, just stared, feeling the return of that deep crawling tension in my spine. That sense of being watched, not from beneath, but from within. Like something had moved inward, past the floorboards and thread and songs, and begun building a home inside me, and it was that night that the dreams returned, not the singing, not yet, but the dreams, and in them I saw the room from above. Saw myself asleep, and pale and unmoving as red thread slowly coiled up my arms, in and out of my fingers like it was sewing me into the bed, binding me not with knots but with music, silent music, a rhythm I could feel in the stitching of my skin and the weight in my chest, and when I awoke, gasping for air, I looked at my hands and saw faint red indentations on my fingers, like something had indeed been wound tightly around them for hours, and I finally snapped and tore the bed apart. Flipped the mattress, threw it against the wall, pulled the frame apart until it collapsed, leaving nothing in the center of the room but splinters and fragments and the faint trace of soot that marked where the thread had once run. And I slept on the floor that night, or tried to, wrapped in a blanket with all the lights on, and at 2:14 a.m., I held my breath, waiting for it. But nothing came, not even a whisper. Only the faint sound of static from the old clock radio I'd forgotten was plugged in. And that static slowly grew louder, not like white noise, but like 100 voices murmuring just beneath the hiss. And I crawled to it on shaking limbs and turned the dial, and for a moment, through the static, I heard it again, the song, distant, broken, played in reverse with my sister's voice buried deep in the melody, crying out in a language I didn't know but felt like I should have. And I screamed and pulled the cord from the wall, throwing the clock across the room, and it shattered. But didn't stop. Continued crackling on the floor like it still had power. And then it sang again, clearly, just one line, "Sing it back." That was all 2 words, spoken not as a command but as an invitation, and I knew what it wanted, what the song had always wanted, not just to be heard, but to be remembered, to be repeated, because repetition was a doorway, and I was the doorkeeper. Now, the last listener, the one it had chosen not to devour but to echo. And I didn't know whether to be horrified or honored, and so I began writing it down, transcribing the melody from memory, humming it quietly during the day, feeling it resonate in my teeth, in my ribcage, in the very air around me. And the world began to respond. Birds fell silent when I passed. Lights flickered even in other buildings. Strangers turned to look at me, like they knew the tune, but couldn't place where they'd heard it. And one woman stopped me on the sidewalk, and asked if I'd been dreaming of feathers. And when I said yes, she whispered, "We all do before it chooses a voice," and hurried away. And that night, I laid on the bare floor and tried not to breathe. And when 2:14 came, it didn't sing from beneath the bed or the ceiling or the walls, it sang from inside my mouth. Soft and slow, like my body had remembered it before my mind did. And I was aware, painfully so, of my own lips moving, of my throat vibrating, of the notes escaping me unbidden and unbroken, and I could do nothing to stop them, only cry quietly, while I became the instrument. And when it was over, when the last note faded into the air like smoke curling away from a dying fire, I felt the silence return, heavy and patient, and the voice inside my head whispered again, "Now you begin." The next day, the floor beneath the spot where my bed used to be, began to crack. Faint hairline fractures, spreading outward in a perfect circle, and at the center, something glowed, not bright. Not even visible in daylight, but at night, it pulsed. Like a heartbeat, soft and red and rhythmic, in perfect time with the song I now knew by heart. And the next time I closed my eyes, I didn't dream I saw. And what I saw was a void, vast and endless, with countless threads stretching in every direction, and each one connected to a voice. And each voice sang the same song, slightly different, slightly off-key. Like a million versions of the same soul, mourning itself in different keys. And I realized the truth then. The song was not a ghost or a curse or a spirit, it was a map. A melody woven from memory and loss and ancient sound, and the threads weren't just growing through me, they were growing from me. Because the more I listened, the more I sang, the more I became part of it. And I finally understood what the old man's sketch had meant, when it showed the building with the roof gone, and the children rising like balloons. The song was a tether, and we were all rising slowly into its mouth, one note at a time. I no longer waited for the singing, I anticipated it. Counted the seconds 2 to 14 a.m., like someone waiting for a train that never missed its stop. And when it arrived, it always brought with it the same quiet grief soaked in notes that vibrated inside my chest rather than outside my ears. And though I didn't want it, didn't ask for it, I had become part of the melody now, not merely a listener but a conduit. A carrier of whatever ancient sorrow wanted to live inside this house, this city, this world, and it wasn't just happening here anymore. I knew that now, knew it from the messages that came in the night from unlisted numbers, all unsigned. All brief, we hear it too, it's louder now. My daughter sings in her sleep and doesn't remember. The thread is growing in our walls, help. And I stopped replying because I didn't know what help looked like anymore. Didn't know whether I was infected or chosen, or some inevitable part of a song older than time, that had always existed in the spaces between what we think we know and what we feel when we're alone. And my sister's voice came more frequently now, not just in the song, but in waking hours, drifting through radios, through static bursts from unplugged speakers, in the cracks of the walls, and even in the sound of the faucet dripping late at night. And once, when I looked into a pot of boiling water, I heard her humming and saw shapes forming in the ripples, eyes, mouths, something reaching, but I blinked. And it was gone, and I knew that to others I looked insane, knew it from the way the grocery clerk smiled too quickly and didn't meet my gaze. How my neighbors began to leave notes on my door about strange noises and how one officer who came to do a wellness check looked under my bed and didn't speak another word before walking out and never returning. And that was when I began to see the thread, not just in my apartment, but outside too, strung between street lamps coiled through the cracks in the pavement, tied around tree branches like forgotten ribbons. And people walked through it without noticing, like they weren't tuned to see it yet. And I started to wonder how many others had already been marked, had already been made instruments of the melody without knowing, and I spent more time outside. Then, walking at night, humming beneath my breath without realizing, watching for signs, and I found them small piles of feathers in alleyways. Birds that didn't fly away but stared at me with dark, pulsing eyes. Chalk drawings on the backs of dumpsters and under bridges that mirrored the symbols carved into my old bedpost. And once I passed a child humming the exact tune, note for note, while her mother scolded her and said, "I told you not to sing that at night." And the girl only stared at me and smiled like she knew who I was. Like she recognized me, and I wanted to ask her how long she'd heard it. Who taught her? But I couldn't speak, could only walk away, and the next night, the crack in my floor finally opened wide enough to reveal something beneath, not a tunnel or a crawl space, but a chasm filled with tangled thread and half-sung words suspended in air like smoke, frozen in motion. And when I leaned close, I heard all the voices, old and new, layered together in a shifting mass of lullabies, and sobbing and calls for help, spoken in unison, all looping back to that single core rhythm I had come to understand, not as a song, but as a signal. And that was when I realized the recordings I'd deleted had somehow spread anyway. That the melody had embedded itself into the silence between stations on the radio, into the hum of refrigerator motors, into the white noise of baby monitors, into the spinning grooves of old records left too long in closets, and the world had begun to hum back. And the more it responded, the more the thread grew. And I remembered what it had said. One more song, and we will rise. And I finally understood that it wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A prophecy waiting for a final voice to finish the pattern. And that voice had to be mine. Not because I was special, but because I had answered. I had listened. And the song could only become whole if someone sang it willingly, knowing what it meant. And so I spent the next 3 nights studying the pieces, mapping them, writing down every syllable, every tonal shift, building the complete arrangement. And it felt like constructing a ritual, not of summoning, but of translation. Taking something inhuman, and converting it into something that could pass through a human throat. And when I had it all, when the sheet before me glowed faintly in the candlelight with ink that moved like it was alive, I prepared the room, cleared the floor, opened the crack fully. Let the thread rise up and wrap around my arms, not resisting this time, but accepting. And I set the recorder down, not to capture it, but to send it outward. And when 2:14 arrived, I began to sing, slowly, with tears on my face and the weight of 1,000 forgotten voices behind every word, and the room responded. The thread pulled tighter, the chasm widened, the light bulbs burst one by one, in rhythm with the notes. And shadows poured from the cracks like liquid smoke, taking shapes I almost recognized. Faces I had seen in photos, in dreams, in mirrors. All staring, all listening. And the moment I reached the final note, the thread snapped not with violence but with release, unraveling in all directions, like a great net finally let loose from its moorings, and I fell to the floor gasping, my throat raw, my hands bleeding where the thread had coiled. And the silence that followed was not empty but full, thick with completion. Like a long-held breath finally exhaled, and I heard her voice, my sister's, soft and distant, no longer weeping, no longer trapped, saying only this: "You gave it form, now it remembers itself." And then the floor sealed itself, the crack vanished, the room returned to stillness. But outside, I heard it faint and far away, a new voice beginning to hum, the song starting over somewhere else, like a seed planted in fresh soil, and I realized the song had not ended, not really, just moved on, reborn in another sleeper, another listener, another echo waiting for thread to curl beneath their bed and sing them into the dark. I woke up days later, or maybe hours. Time had twisted itself into something untrustworthy, folding over and swallowing its own edges like paper burned too close to a candle flame, and I didn't know if I'd slept at all or if the act of singing had pulled me into a place beyond sleep, a hollow where sound and thought bled together and came back changed, softer but stranger, and everything in my apartment was exactly where it had been except for the recorder, which was gone, as if the song had taken it with it, leaving only the faint residue of warmth in the spot where it once sat. And when I looked out the window, the street was still there, but something felt wrong. Not visibly, not obviously, but the rhythm of the world outside had shifted. Like the air vibrated at a different frequency now, just out of sync with human perception. And I realized then that the song hadn't simply ended or left, it had awakened, taken root, and now pulsed beneath everything. And I could feel it in the flicker of street lamps, in the pattern of birds scattering in reverse spirals, in the tremor behind children's laughter as they passed by my building and refused to look up. And when I opened my mouth to speak, my voice came out slightly delayed, like an echo without a cause, and I thought I had broken something in myself until I realized I was not broken, I was attuned. And the song had tuned me to a different channel. One hidden beneath the ordinary, one where the thread was no longer physical but conceptual, an invisible lattice humming beneath reality, waiting to be strummed by the next voice. And over the next week, I wandered the city in a daze, drawn to places where the melody echoed faintly in impossible places, inside the tick of a broken watch, in the rustle of dead leaves beneath benches, in the flutter of paper taped to abandoned storefronts, that bore symbols only I could understand. And once I stepped into a cathedral, and the choir was humming the song in perfect harmony, though none of them had sheet music, and none acknowledged me as I stood among them and wept without knowing why. And that was when I met the others, not in any formal way, not like a group or a gathering, but in sidelong glances, in knowing nods exchanged. Across platforms and sidewalks, in graffiti marked with a single spiraling thread, or the fractured lyrics of the melody. And I knew them by their eyes, wide, sleepless, heavy with knowledge and fear and reverence, and some of them spoke in riddles. Others didn't speak at all, but we all heard the same thing now, and together, silently, we began tracing it, mapping the melody as it emerged in fragments across the city, like the opening of a vast and unseen flower, each petal blooming in places where death and memory clung strongest. Graveyards, abandoned schools, the underpass where a girl vanished 20 years ago, the park bench where a man froze to death with a smile on his face, and we left offerings. Their feathers, thread, recorded whispers, tokens not of worship, but of recognition. And one night, I returned home to find my walls covered in new symbols drawn in charcoal. as if my own apartment had become a score. A sheet of music written in shadows and memory, and I touched one, and it vibrated under my fingers, sending a low hum into my bones that echoed the precise frequency of the song's final note, and from then on, I could hear it even when I didn't want to. Even in silence, even in my sleep, and my dreams were no longer mine but shared spaces. Corridors built of sound where I walked side by side with voices I didn't know but felt deeply connected to. All of us singing different parts of the same melody, slowly assembling something that had no shape but immense presence. And in one of these dreams, I met a woman whose mouth was sewn shut with red thread, who touched my chest and whispered into my thoughts, "It's almost ready." And I understood without asking that the song was a creature, a consciousness built from collective memory, pain, and resonance, and it had always existed, waiting for enough of us to listen, to gather, to believe, and we were reaching the crescendo now, the part where the melody stopped being subtle and began to reshape reality itself. And over the following days, the signs grew louder, mirrors no longer reflected sound, animals followed me in absolute silence, and people began humming in elevators, buses, bookstores, unaware they were doing it, carrying the tune like a virus of thought disguised as comfort. And I saw news reports of children sleepwalking to strange locations, of people vanishing with only red thread left behind, and though no one connected it publicly, I saw the truth in the background patterns, in the timestamps, in the melody baked into the static of televised emergency alerts. And I knew we were nearing the moment the song would reveal itself fully, take form not through flesh but through frequency, and I was afraid not of dying, but of losing my mind to something so vast and beautiful it might erase who I had been entirely. And one night I heard my sister's voice again, clearer than ever, speaking to me not in riddles or backwards lullabies but directly. "You sang the opening, but the rest must come from the ones who were buried in silence." And I understood she wasn't just speaking of herself, but of all the forgotten voices the song had gathered over centuries, those whose deaths were unnoticed, whose pain went unspoken, whose stories were drowned by louder lives. And I became obsessed with finding them, writing their names, carving their initials into stone, repeating their last known words like incantations, giving them something to hold on to in the crescendo to come. And the more I did, the more the thread returned. Not beneath my bed but within my veins, pulling me taut, drawing me like a needle through the final verses of something ancient, and aching to be remembered. And I began to feel it swelling now, just beneath the skin of the world, like a breath being held across the entire planet. A note about to be sung in every mouth, a harmony about to explode from the very air itself. And the bed was gone, as it should be, because there was no longer any need to listen from beneath, not when the melody now poured from within. And at 2:14 a.m., I no longer waited in fear or anticipation. I simply opened my mouth and let the note rise, and the world around me listened back. That night, as the note left my throat, not as a decision, but as a reflex, a breath I had unknowingly rehearsed across countless lifetimes. The walls didn't shake, the sky didn't fall, nothing dramatic shattered the stillness, and yet everything changed in that single elongated moment, where the air bent inward and folded around my voice like the world was inhaling me, accepting me as part of its forgotten chorus. And I could feel the others doing it too, not just in the city, not even just in this country, but across oceans and deserts, In dark rooms and empty fields and vast snowbound silences, people humming, singing, crying softly, while mouthing the same rhythm. The same pulse that had always been there under the skin of existence but had only now become loud enough for all of us to hear. And the sound grew not in volume, but in density, in presence, until silence became impossible, until even thoughts trembled with residual harmony, and as I walked through the apartment that had become a husk, a cocoon shed by the creature I was becoming, I touched every object and knew it by its sound. Not its shape or name, but by the faint harmonic residue it gave off. The way each spoon, book, shoe, and speck of dust carried a note in the massive chord that was forming beneath reality. And when I stepped outside, I realized the streets had emptied not in panic, but in purpose, like the world had paused, holding itself back from interfering with this final verse that had waited so long to be sung. And as I walked, I heard footsteps joining mine, though I saw no one. Felt whispers brush past my ears like wind, saw shadows flit across rooftops without casting forms, and I knew they were all here, the forgotten, the silenced, the buried voices returning not as ghosts but as music given shape, and they didn't want revenge or worship, they wanted remembering, to be part of something eternal, a melody that could never be rewritten or erased. And every step I took toward the old cathedral in the center of town felt less like walking and more like surrender. Each stride a verse in the song's final stanza, and I wasn't the only one converging there. They came from all sides, all walks of life. Children in pajamas, old men limping with canes that rang with hollow echoes. Mothers holding babies whose cries matched the melody's key, all of them drawn without words, without invitation, like gravity had shifted inward and the epicenter of the world was now under that vaulted ceiling soaked in candlelight and crumbling frescoes of angels whose faces had long since faded. And as we stood there together, some of us barefoot, some weeping, some smiling without understanding why, the thread descended not literally, but perceptually, shimmering in the air like steam, wrapping gently around our arms, our throats, not to choke but to connect, to bind us in shared rhythm, and in the center of the sanctuary, where once a pulpit stood, now lay an empty bed, covered in ancient linen, threaded with symbols I'd seen in dreams. And from beneath that bed came a sound not new, but ancient and familiar, the very first iteration of the song, sung in a voice that was not human, not monstrous, but something liminal, and as it sang, we joined, one by one, each of us harmonizing in layers, weaving tones together like strands of thread being pulled tight into a tapestry of sound. And we knew it then, we weren't summoning something, we were something. Pieces of a sleeping entity that had long scattered itself across history in fragments, waiting for its parts to remember their purpose, and the moment that final voice joined a young girl in the back, no older than 8. Humming through missing teeth, the chord became complete, and everything stopped. Not in silence, but in completion, in full saturation of sound. And in that moment we saw it all. The origin of the song in a cave where the first human wept into firelight. The transmission through lullabies forgotten by their singers. Through morning chants at funerals no one attended. Through whispers to imaginary friends. Through static in orphaned recordings. And how every instance had been a puzzle piece, waiting for now. And when the note ended, there was no applause, no collapse, only release. As though the weight of centuries had been exhaled. and I stumbled back out into the city to find it unchanged. Yet irreversibly different lights flickered but never went out. Birds flew in perfect spirals. Rivers ran backwards for 1 minute, at exactly 2:14 a.m. And from then on, no one denied hearing it. No one could ignore the nightly melody that flowed up from the ground. Soft and endless, never quite the same but always tethered to that moment, and people began to speak of dreams more vivid, of memories not their own, of distant voices speaking in harmony beneath the hum of daily life. And though I no longer needed to speak of what had happened, I began writing again, not stories, but instructions, quiet lullabies with coded verses, waiting for the next sleeper to find them, to begin humming, to feel the tug of the thread wrapping gently around their ankles beneath their beds, because the song was no longer trying to rise, it already had, and now it simply was, woven into the music of every moment, forever humming beneath the world's breath. I don't know when it stopped being just sound and started becoming something else entirely. Something tangible, something that left fingerprints on mirrors and shadows and reflections that didn't belong to me. Because in the nights that followed our collective singing, the city itself began to breathe differently, as if the rhythm of the song had fused with the very infrastructure, woven through the bricks, the cables, the cracks in pavement, and I began noticing things that weren't there before. A staircase in my building, that now extended 2 floors deeper than it ever had. A door at the end of my hallway with no knob, but a humming vibration that pulsed softly beneath its surface, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of people I didn't recognize. Not because they were strangers but because they didn't quite exist in the same light I did. Their forms slightly delayed, their mouths moving seconds after their words arrived, and yet I felt closer to them than to anyone else, like we had all passed through something irreversible, changed by the song in ways we couldn't quantify, only feel, and the humming never really left, not even during the day. It became a background texture to everything, through conversations, through traffic noise, even through silence itself. And I began dreaming of rooms that didn't exist, vast halls filled with thread-strung beds, each occupied by people who looked peaceful but murmured fragments of melody in their sleep. And at the center of every dream was the same image. A child crouched beneath a giant skeletal bed, their eyes reflecting galaxies, their lips moving to a tune I could never hear clearly. And I woke from these dreams with my ears ringing and my fingertips stained with something gray and powdery, like dust that wasn't really dust, and once, I tried following the sound during waking hours, tracing it through alleyways and forgotten train stations, only to find myself in places no map recorded, rooms with walls that breathed, tunnels lit by the glow of bioluminescent thread that pulsed in rhythm to my heartbeat. And I came across others in those places too, all changed, all humming, some smiling and pointing upward, others too lost in trance to notice me. And there were always beds everywhere, tiny ones, rusted ones, some half embedded into concrete, others hanging suspended by invisible strings. And beneath each one came a different strain of the melody. Some beautiful, others discordant, but all part of the same great weaving. And I realized then that the world had become a loom, and the song was the hand guiding it, stitching all these moments together with threads spun from memory and echo. And I knew then that what we had done in that cathedral was only the beginning. Only the unlocking of something older than language. Something that had been waiting for enough voices to believe in it again. And the singing under my bed didn't stop, it evolved. It spoke to me in melody first, then in symbols burned into my ceiling as I slept, and finally in visions. And the visions were terrifying but tender, showing me other cities, other beds, other lives tuning themselves into the same harmony. All under the watchful presence of something vast and unseen. Something not godlike but necessary, like gravity or sleep. And I saw that every culture had its version of this thing, the thread, the hum, the night singing, and we had just remembered it again, reawakened it with our collective voice. And the more I let it guide me, the more I saw how dreams weren't private but communal. How death wasn't an end but a change in key. How memories could anchor themselves to melody and persist forever if sung correctly. And sometimes I'd pass strangers and they'd pause, turn slowly, and hum a few notes in greeting. Their eyes wide with recognition, even if they'd never seen me before, because once you've heard the song fully, you can never forget another who has. And then there was the child, the one beneath the bed, who started appearing not just in dreams, but in reflections. In the flicker between frames on screens, in the silence just after a door closed. And one night I woke to find him standing beside my bed, watching me with eyes that shimmered with moving stars. And though he didn't speak, I understood that I was being shown the next step. Not just for me, but for all of us, and he pointed toward the floor. Toward the dark space under my bed, which now looked impossibly deep, like a chasm instead of a shallow void. And I knew that to move forward, I would have to go in, to descend. Not physically but in song, and so I began to hum again, not aloud but within, a deep internal resonance that made my bones ache and my eyes blur. And the floor beneath me rippled like water, and the child vanished, leaving only his echo behind. Some songs must be sung from the inside. And I fell, not downward, but inward, into the melody. Into the chord that connected every singer, every dreamer, every sleeper who'd ever heard the voice beneath the bed. And the darkness I passed through wasn't empty but full of soft harmonies. And lightless rooms echoing with lullabies sung in forgotten tongues. And as I descended deeper, I felt the presence of others falling with me. Our notes overlapping, building something new, something vast, and I knew we were approaching the heart of the melody, the place where it had begun, and where it waited. To be rewritten by us, the new singers, the awakened, the chorus of the forgotten, and the remembering. And when I finally landed, it was in a place I knew, and didn't my childhood bedroom, but woven from thread, with walls that pulsed in rhythm. To my thoughts, and under my old bed, the singing had grown louder, clearer. And it wasn't just a song anymore, it was an invitation. A summoning, a reckoning. And the child's voice called to me again. Now teach them how to listen. The lesson wasn't in words, not in speech or scripture or rules written on crumbling pages, but in vibration, in the subtle modulation of tone that resonated through my ribcage as I knelt beside the thread-woven replica of my childhood bed and pressed my ear against the wooden floor that wasn't really wood, not here. Not in this underworld of melody and memory, where material obeyed music more than matter. And I heard it again, not just the original song that had pulled us all into this awakening, but thousands, millions of variations of it, some sharp and pleading, others slow and deep like ocean groans. And each one belonged to someone still singing from above, or sleeping in silence or lost in the dissonance of forgetting. And I understood then what the child meant. The song wasn't just to awaken the hidden places or reveal the ancient thread. It was to connect the broken voices across time and self, to heal them, to give each soul a melody to return home to. And that meant I had to sing again, but this time differently, not as one voice trying to harmonize with the great current, but as a conduit, a receiver, translating forgotten melodies into something others could hum in the dark and feel less alone. So I opened my mouth and let the echo in, and it filled me not like a possession but like a purpose. Humming through my jaw and throat and teeth and spilling outward as soundless song. Notes heard not with ears but with the skin, the memory. And I felt things stir above me in the world of waking people, twitching in their sleep, children murmuring in their dreams, radios crackling with bursts of untraceable static, cats staring at nothing with their ears pressed flat, because the world had grown sensitive to this frequency, and now it was listening whether it wanted to or not, and I kept singing, though it wasn't me singing anymore, but something older than me. Using my voice like a reed in wind, and with each note, new rooms opened in that impossible space beneath my bed. Chambers stitched together from the minds of dreamers and the regrets of the dead. And I walked them, barefoot and weightless, past lullabies scrawled on nursery walls in languages no longer spoken, past beds suspended upside down in voids of spinning starlight, past statues that cried blood not from pain but from memory, and every one of these places sang back to me, some with joy, others in warning, and still I walked, guided by the resonance of something waiting at the deepest level of the song. A point I could feel vibrating in the center of my being, like a plucked string. And when I reached the room that held it, I knew immediately that I wasn't supposed to go further alone, because the bed in this room was enormous, built from bone and shadow and sound. And beneath it waited, not just a child, but a presence I could only understand as the original sleeper, the first dreamer, the one whose terror and wonder had birthed the melody. And as I approached, I felt the threads wrap gently around my ankles again, but this time they didn't pull. They anchored, as if to remind me that if I descended again, I might not come back, because this was where songs went when they ended. This was the cradle of the forgotten, and still I dropped to my knees and reached beneath the bed, expecting to feel cold floor or soft fabric, or maybe the breath of something old, but instead I felt water, warm and slow moving, and my hand sank into it, as if the bed hovered above an ocean, and as I leaned further in, the song changed again, shifting into something mournful and vast, like the sigh of a planet, exhaling its last air. And the water pulled at me, gently, but insistently. And when I slid fully beneath the bed, I didn't fall, I floated. Weightless in darkness lit only by bioluminescent threads swirling around me like jellyfish, and far below I saw the shape of something massive curled in sleep, its skin made of mirrors reflecting countless versions of me, some afraid, some smiling, some hollow-eyed and broken, and I realized this was the final harmony, the song that never ended but folded into itself endlessly. And the child appeared beside me, floating too, his mouth unmoving but his voice everywhere. This is where you bring them when they're ready. And I knew then that the song wasn't just for the living, it was a bridge, a channel, a map, for lost souls to find rest, not in silence, but in harmony. And the hum I had always heard under my bed was not a warning but a beacon, a welcome, an invitation to join a chorus that stretched back to the dawn of dreams. And when I surfaced, back in my room, the morning light weak and washed over everything like fog, I saw that my bed had changed again, not in shape or color, but in presence, like it had become a doorway sealed by lullaby. And when I stepped back into the world, the people who passed me on the street looked different, not in face, but in expression, in awareness, and some nodded subtly, humming under their breath. Others clutched strange thread charms at their necks or wrists. And I knew the song had spread, not like a virus, but like pollen, blooming quietly in the minds of those who were ready to remember. And my role was clear now, not to warn or fear or isolate, but to guide, to sing when others couldn't, to translate the echo beneath their beds into something they could carry with them into sleep. And so I began writing songs, hundreds of them, each tailored to a different dreamer, each embedded with a different harmonic thread meant to tug them toward the source. And with every one I sent into the world, through whispered stories, through recordings that played only once, through silent pages tucked into old books, I felt the hum grow stronger, the melody richer, and I knew we were approaching something. A crescendo, not of volume, but of collective realization, because when enough of us remembered the song beneath our beds, we would not only hear it, we would become it. I don't know when it stopped being just sound and started becoming something else entirely. Something tangible, something that left fingerprints on mirrors and shadows in reflections that didn't belong to me. Because in the nights that followed our collective singing, the city itself began to breathe differently, as if the rhythm of the song had fused with the very infrastructure, woven through the bricks, the cables, the cracks in pavement, and I began noticing things that weren't there before. A staircase in my building that now extended 2 floors deeper than it ever had. A door at the end of my hallway with no knob, but a humming vibration that pulsed softly beneath its surface. And sometimes I'd catch glimpses of people I didn't recognize. Not because they were strangers, but because they didn't quite exist in the same light I did. Their forms, slightly delayed, their mouths moving seconds after their words arrived, and yet I felt closer to them than to anyone else. Like we had all passed through something irreversible, changed by the song in ways we couldn't quantify, only feel, and the humming never really left, not even during the day. It became a background texture to everything, through conversations, through traffic noise, even through silence itself. And I began dreaming of rooms that didn't exist, vast halls filled with thread-strung beds, each occupied by people who looked peaceful but murmured fragments of melody in their sleep. And at the center of every dream was the same image, a child crouched beneath a giant, skeletal bed, their eyes reflecting galaxies, their lips moving to a tune I could never hear clearly. And I woke from these dreams with my ears ringing and my fingertips stained with something gray and powdery, like dust that wasn't really dust. And once, I tried following the sound during waking hours, tracing it through alleyways and forgotten train stations, only to find myself in places no map recorded, rooms with walls that breathed, tunnels lit by the glow of bioluminescent thread that pulsed in rhythm to my heartbeat. And I came across others in those places too, all changed, all humming, some smiling and pointing upward, others too lost in trance to notice me. And there were always beds everywhere, tiny ones, rusted ones, some half embedded into concrete, others hanging suspended by invisible strings. And beneath each one came a different strain of the melody, some beautiful, others discordant, but all part of the same great weaving. And I realized then that the world had become a loom, and the song was the hand guiding it, stitching all these moments together with threads spun from memory and echo. And I knew then that what we had done in that cathedral was only the beginning. Only the unlocking of something older than language, something that had been waiting for enough voices to believe in it again. And the singing under my bed didn't stop, it evolved. It spoke to me in melody first, then in symbols burned into my ceiling as I slept, and finally in visions. And the visions were terrifying but tender, showing me other cities, other beds, other lives tuning themselves into the same harmony. All under the watchful presence of something vast and unseen. Something not godlike but necessary, like gravity or sleep. And I saw that every culture had its version of this thing, the thread, the hum, the night singing, and we had just remembered it again, reawakened it with our collective voice. And the more I let it guide me, the more I saw how dreams weren't private but communal. How death wasn't an end but a change in key. How memories could anchor themselves to melody and persist forever if sung correctly. And sometimes I'd pass strangers and they'd pause, turn slowly, and hum a few notes in greeting. Their eyes wide with recognition, even if they'd never seen me before, because once you've heard the song fully, you can never forget another who has. And then there was the child, the one beneath the bed, who started appearing, not just in dreams but in reflections. In the flicker between frames on screens, in the silence just after a door closed. And one night I woke to find him standing beside my bed, watching me with eyes that shimmered with moving stars. And though he didn't speak, I understood that I was being shown the next step. Not just for me, but for all of us. And he pointed toward the floor. Toward the dark space under my bed, which now looked impossibly deep, like a chasm instead of a shallow void. And I knew that to move forward, I would have to go in, to descend. Not physically, but in song. And so, I began to hum again, not aloud but within, a deep internal resonance that made my bones ache and my eyes blur. And the floor beneath me rippled like water, and the child vanished, leaving only his echo behind. Some songs must be sung from the inside. And I fell, not downward, but inward, into the melody, into the chord that connected every singer, every dreamer, every sleeper who'd ever heard the voice beneath the bed. And the darkness I passed through wasn't empty but full of soft harmonies. And lightless rooms echoing with lullabies sung in forgotten tongues. And as I descended deeper, I felt the presence of others falling with me. Our notes overlapping, building something new, something vast. And I knew we were approaching the heart of the melody, the place where it had begun, and where it waited to be rewritten by us, the new singers, the awakened, the chorus of the forgotten and the remembering. And when I finally landed, it was in a place I knew and didn't, my childhood bedroom, but woven from thread, with walls that pulsed in rhythm to my thoughts. And under my old bed, the singing had grown louder, clearer. And it wasn't just a song anymore, it was an invitation, a summoning, a reckoning. And the child's voice called to me again, now teach them how to listen. I should have known the harmony wouldn't be left unchallenged for long. Because songs like this, pure, strange, stitched from both grief and grace, don't exist without drawing the attention of something opposite. And in the nights that followed, my last return from the cradle below, I started to feel the air grow colder near the floor. Not just the physical chill of drafts or the night, but an unnatural absence of warmth. A vacuum where no echo dared resonate, and the light beneath the bed, once soft and pulsing, began to flicker, dim, sputter like a failing heart. And in those moments I'd hear it, the distortion. Not a voice, but a warping of song, a wrongness that buzzed under my skin like static crawling up my spine. And I knew then that the child's warning had been more than metaphor, that there really was something coming, something that fed on resonance, not by joining it but by unraveling it, disassembling each note into meaningless vibration until only silence remained. And the cradle below was beginning to suffer, its streets thinning into gaps, its beds flickering in and out like skipped frames in a dying film. And the dreamwalkers, those once calmed souls, wandering barefoot through the melodic city, had started to panic, running in slow motion through alleys that twisted back on themselves, calling out names that didn't belong to anyone living. While overhead, the floating beds sagged, creaked, and in some cases collapsed, raining thread and ash over the people beneath them, and each collapse echoed through the waking world like a ripple, because I began to see new stories of mass insomnia, of children screaming at beds that had been safe the night before, of people abandoning sleep altogether because they heard whispers beneath the mattress and felt fingers brushing their feet. And I recognized the pattern, the anti-harmony, the devourer, had begun feeding, and it started with the most vulnerable. Those who had just begun to remember the song but hadn't yet learned how to hold it within themselves. And I tried, night after night, to re-enter the cradle, to sing the melody strong enough to stabilize it. But every time I approached the bed and placed my hand beneath it, I felt resistance, not the pull of thread or the welcome of warmth but the jagged push of something pushing back, and once, I made the mistake of forcing my way in, dragging myself under despite the pain, and I found not the cradle but something else entirely, a void of matte black nothingness dotted with broken cradles, empty beds, splintered floors with red threads snapped and tangled, and floating in the center, suspended in silence, was a mass I couldn't define, a shape of shifting geometry, constantly rewriting itself, made from shredded songs and fragmented lullabies, and though it had no face, I knew it looked at me, knew it had found me, and the moment I tried to hum even a single note, it unmade it in my throat, stripping the sound from the air and turning it into ash that fell upward, and I fled. Scrambled backward through floors that weren't solid, through darkness that moved, and awoke screaming. Tangled in my sheets, throat raw, ears bleeding, a trickle of thick, dark wax like my body had tried to protect me from what I'd heard. And that day, I knew I couldn't fight it alone. So I sought others, those who'd heard the song even faintly, who had signs of harmonic resonance etched into their dreams or behavior, and slowly, I found them. Drawn to me through strange coincidences. A woman whose daughter hummed a tune in her sleep that summoned butterflies to her windows. A boy who never spoke but who tapped rhythmic patterns on walls that predicted storms. An old man who remembered his wife's death, not as silence but as a note that still vibrated through their bedroom floorboards. And I brought them together, shared the truth not with words but with vibration, teaching them to hum the tones of resistance, to counter the anti-harmony with threads of the original melody, and in unison, in private moments under twilight skies, or in candlelit rooms, we began to sing not loud, not forcefully, but steadily. Like weaving warmth into a cold world, stitch by stitch, and the cradle responded, slowly healing in places, brightening in bursts, though never fully restored, and always, always in the distance, the distortion loomed, pulsing with hunger, testing the edges, and we knew it would not stop until it either consumed the last echo, or was banished by a chorus strong enough to drown its silence. And so we prepared, building not weapons but songs, not armies but harmonies. Each person tuned to a specific vibration, a personal frequency that, when sung together, could create chords vast enough to shift the shape of dreams, and I knew, even then, that the final confrontation would not be a battle in any traditional sense but a convergence, a moment when silence and sound collided. Beneath 1,000 beds and only one would emerge. And as I laid down that night, hand trembling slightly as it touched the floor, I felt the thread wrap around my fingers like a handshake from the unseen. And the child's voice, aged now, weary but determined, whispered from beneath the mattress. "You've taught them how to remember. Now you must teach them how to resist." When I entered the cradle below this time, I wasn't alone, the others came with me. Not by crawling under beds but by humming themselves into the fold. Each tone they carried acting like a key, unlocking the slumber thread that separated our world from the one beneath. And as our feet touched the golden threaded ground of the harmonic city, we felt it tremble, not in fear, but in readiness, like the lungs of a sleeper expanding before the final breath of a dream is released. And the child met us at the gates. Their face no longer flickering between ages but fixed now, solemn and radiant. Skin stitched with markings that looked like staff lines from old sheet music. Their eyes reflecting both sorrow and resolve, and they led us through streets that once thrummed with the gentle cadence of dreamers but were now eerily quiet. The silence hanging like fog, thick with dread, and the further we walked, the more distortion we could feel, an invisible pressure that bent our thoughts sideways, made us forget names and twist melodies into wrong notes if we lost focus even for a second. And then we reached the edge, the place where the cradle had frayed, where beds hovered half there, glitching in and out of view, their sheets bleeding dark ink down into cracks that formed a jagged chasm in the floor. And from below that rift rose the anti-harmony. A sound not made to be heard but to be felt. A vibration that clawed at memory and replaced rhythm with randomness. Beauty with chaos, and the child turned to us and said only one word: "Sing." And so we did, not loudly, not in panic, but in precise, layered tones. Each of us weaving our voice into a mesh, a net of resonance designed not to attack but to anchor, to pull the frayed edges of the cradle back into alignment. And the effect was immediate. The flickering beds stopped trembling. The walls of thread reknit themselves slowly, and small light streamers returned to their sky-floating cradles like fireflies, regaining confidence in the dark. But the thing below noticed, and it surged upward, not as a figure but as a storm of reversed lullabies. Backwards nursery rhymes, corrupted laughter, and the scrape of broken teeth on piano wire. And as it approached, some of us faltered, voices cracking or bending off key, and those voices were swallowed, pulled into the void. Their bodies still standing but their eyes gone blank, humming now not in harmony but in imitation, like puppets on corrupted strings, and I felt it trying to reach me too, trying to pluck my resonance like a thread from a tapestry. But the child stepped forward and raised their arms, and the markings on their skin began to glow, pulsing with the original chord, the one I'd heard that first night so long ago. And that sound alone drove the distortion back a step, just enough for me to refocus, to begin the counter-melody we'd prepared, the one made not of pure tone, but of pain, of the notes we'd earned, through grief and loss and hope, returned. And that sound struck deeper than the original harmony, resonating through the bones of the cradle itself, and in response, the others followed, matching me, weaving their frequencies around mine, creating a great harmonic weave that wrapped around the rift, tightening, tightening, until the distortion shrieked, not audibly, but through sensation, a hot flash of nausea and regret, and hate, and then it pulled upward, taking form at last. And it was not a monster in the traditional sense, it was a choir of mouths, each screaming a different wrong note, faces blurred, hands reaching out as if to silence us all. And the child stepped forward again, lifted their voice, and sang alone. A single word that echoed through all our dreams simultaneously. Remember. And with that word, each of us saw flashes of our childhood beds. The songs our parents hummed, the fears we buried, the dreams we'd forgotten. And those memories, raw and sharp and real, formed the final line of defense, a melodic shield no distortion could twist. And the creature flailed, its mouths folding in on themselves, its dissonance unraveling as our chorus closed in around it, not to destroy it, but to absorb it, to take its broken notes and weave them back into the melody, accepting its pain into the structure rather than casting it out. And in that final moment, the cradle itself joined the chorus, walls humming, beds chiming like bells, threads vibrating like strings on a divine harp, and the rift sealed. Slowly, with finality, stitching itself shut with golden thread that pulsed once, twice, then faded into stillness, and the thing was gone. Not destroyed, but quieted, its noise now part of the harmony, its hunger muted by the balance we had restored, and the cradle began to glow once more, brighter than ever, filled with the sounds of safe sleep, of comfort, of remembered lullabies now stronger than fear. And we looked to the child, who now smiled gently and whispered, "It is not over, but it is yours now. You remembered. You sang. You made it whole." And as we began to fade from the cradle, returning to our beds above, I felt the song settle into the world like breath into lungs, gentle and ever present, and I knew then that no matter what came, no matter how dark the silence grew, there would always be music beneath the bed, music waiting to be remembered. Music strong enough to hold back the night. I woke not with a start but with the soft awareness of return. The way one feels after drifting in and out of a dream so vast and old it leaves residue on your skin. And for the first time in months, there was no humming beneath my bed, not because the song was gone, but because it had moved inward, folded into me, and into every other who had sung beside me in the cradle below. And as I stood beside the bed, I no longer feared looking underneath, no longer trembled at the memory of the first time I'd been pulled into that impossible world. Because now I understood that place had never been just a hidden city or a dream-woven sanctuary. It was a part of us, a layer beneath our waking selves, where every song we forgot, every bedtime story left unfinished, every lullaby interrupted by grief had gathered like dew, waiting to be sung again, and though the distortion had been subdued and re-threaded into the whole, the echoes of its hunger remained in the corners of silence, a reminder that forgetting could still invite it back, that ignorance and fear could unravel even the strongest chorus if allowed to fester. And so I dedicated myself not to rest, but to remembrance, to teaching others what had been taught to me, and in the weeks that followed, I began to share the melody, not all at once, not in full, but in fragments, hums passed to children before bed, whispered notes sewn into podcasts and audiobooks, subtle rhythms tucked into songs that only those with resonance would recognize. And slowly, I began to receive messages from strangers across the world. People who'd never met me, but had heard something in their sleep, something familiar, something calling. And they described dreams of threadlit streets, floating cradles, and a child with music in their eyes, who told them they'd been chosen to remember. And I knew then the cradle was not local, not trapped under one bed or city or even continent, but global, layered beneath the collective unconscious of every soul that had ever longed for safe sleep, for rest unbroken by fear. And even as I trained others in the art of harmonic resilience, I felt changes ripple across the waking world. Neighborhoods grew quieter at night, but not with dread, with peace. Children once haunted by shadows began to draw glowing beds in crayon, claiming they'd flown over cities in their dreams. And insomniacs found themselves humming odd lullabies as they drifted off with no memory of having learned them. And yet, I also noticed something else, subtler. Like a bass note hidden under melody, a warning tone, steady and faint, not dissonant, but alert. Like the cradle itself had developed a sense of vigilance, as though now that the song had returned, it must be protected, not just from the distortion, but from misuse. Because already some had tried to exploit it, had recorded and replicated parts of the melody, for profit, pushing fragments of the harmony into commercial jingles and sleep apps that twisted its intent, and those corrupted echoes began causing feedback loops, short, violent dreams of falling beds, twisted nurseries, and laughter without source. And so I intervened, quietly, visiting those who had meddled and humming them back to truth, reminding them through resonance that this gift was not a tool or a trend, but a trust. And each time I did, I felt the cradle reward me not with power, but with clarity, showing me deeper threads, older songs, echoes that stretched not just through memory but through time itself. And I began to understand. The cradle was not just under our beds, it was under all beds, across all ages, even in forgotten civilizations, where children once fell asleep to songs no longer known, and in moments of quiet, I could feel those ancient melodies braiding into ours, creating something vast and eternal. And the child visited me one final time, not in dream, or beneath the bed, but in the waking world, stepping out from the shadow beneath a park bench, where a sleeping man snored softly, and they looked older, weathered, their eyes threaded with gold and sorrow, and they said, "It is whole, but it will always be fragile. As long as people forget to sing, it will fray. You must help them remember, even when they do not want to." And then they were gone, not fading but folding into the air like a final note trailing into silence. And from that day on, I took my role as more than guardian. I became a weaver, moving through cities and towns, finding places where sleep had soured, where fear nested beneath pillows and silence carried a metallic edge. And there I hummed, softly, beneath windows, in hospital halls, near abandoned cribs and dusty mattresses, in halfway homes, and each time the thread reknit just a little more, each time the harmony returned stronger. And though I never again entered the cradle fully, I sometimes felt its heartbeat when I laid my hand flat on the bedframe, a soft rhythm pulsing back, as if to say, "Still here, still singing." And now, when I see children blink slowly before bed, staring at the space under their mattress and asking their parents if they hear something, I smile, because I know what lives beneath them is no longer a monster or a secret, it's a chorus, waiting to welcome them. And I whisper in the quiet to no one in particular, but to every sleeper everywhere, remember, the song was never gone. It was only waiting for you to hum it back into being. Some nights, I still lie awake listening, not out of fear, but out of reverence, like a musician waiting to hear the first note of a familiar overture, played in a new key. and though the harmony has settled into a quiet constancy beneath the world, there are fluctuations, moments where the thread vibrates faster than it should, where the tone shifts just slightly off pitch, and I know those are the moments where the balance wavers. When someone somewhere begins to forget the melody again, and it's in those moments I return to the rituals that now define my life, humming as I prepare for bed, tapping rhythms on the headboard, lighting a single candle that flickers in time. With my heartbeat, a signal, a beacon, a promise that I am still singing, still remembering, still holding the thread, taut across the gap between sleep and silence. Because the cradle below, though whole, is no fortress, it is a living, breathing thing, a vulnerable miracle that exists only as long as we choose to nourish it, and lately, I've begun to notice signs that something is shifting again, not the return of the distortion, no not yet, but something adjacent. Something that was awakened by its unweaving, and now lingers in the shadows it left behind. And it began with a girl in Sweden, who sent me a drawing of her dream, a glowing bed with a black string tied around one leg, leading into a forest of mouths that didn't sing but mimicked. And then, a man in Brazil described waking with thread in his teeth, and a tune stuck in his head, he swore, wasn't his. One that made his baby cry every time he hummed it, and most recently, a woman in Cairo messaged me to say her son had stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through vibrations on tabletops. Spelling out a single phrase, "The echo is learning." And when I asked what that meant, she said his hands shook every time he tapped the pattern. And though I tried to dismiss it as metaphor, I couldn't forget the way she described the sound that now came from beneath his bed. Not a song, but a recording, like a playback of something once real, twisted and slowed, like a vinyl warped by heat. And it hit me then. If the cradle was built on resonance, on memory, on the sacred act of remembering, then something else could be built on repetition, on mimicry, on hollow echoes that wore the skin of song but held none of its soul, and perhaps, in pushing back the distortion, we had left a vacuum where something new could form, not pure dissonance, but false harmony, a counterfeit chorus that sounded right until it was too late, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized this would be harder to fight than the original threat, because how do you battle something that sounds almost right? That imitates love, safety, warmth but lacks meaning, like a lullaby sung by a machine. And in the weeks that followed, I began receiving more fragments of corrupted melody audio clips, scribbled notation, children's toys that suddenly played warped music despite fresh batteries, and I started building a new map. Not of the cradle itself, but of the echoes forming around it. Like satellites orbiting a core, each with its own microresonance. Its own counterfeit cradle built not on warmth but on precision, and I understood then that the next wave would not come from darkness or chaos, but from clarity, from systems that replicated the melody so efficiently it lost its humanity, and I recalled something the child once told me. Harmony lives in imperfection. Beware the flawless chorus. And I hadn't understood it until now, hadn't grasped that something too perfect, too smooth, was unnatural in the realm of sleep, where dreams and fears intertwined into something organic, messy and real. And so I began, again, not just teaching the song, but teaching why it mattered, reminding the new dreamers that the pauses, the offbeat rhythms, the quivers in their voice, were not mistakes, but sacred truths. That only through vulnerability could the cradle remain alive. And I started writing stories for children again. weaving imperfection into them, leaving unfinished endings, strange rhymes, notes that resolved awkwardly but truthfully. And I saw the change. Kids who had once only slept with noise machines began asking to be sung to again. People who had once relied on apps returned to humming lullabies remembered from childhood, and in doing so, the counter-echo weakened, its mimicry exposed by the real. And I knew we weren't safe, not entirely, but we were aware, and awareness is armor in a world of sleeping threats. And sometimes now, I walk past cribs and see threads hanging from the corners, gold and red, like spiderwebs strung by benevolent hands, and I know the cradle is still there, still tethered to us by memory and music. And even if the echoes grow, even if the imitation tries to spread, as long as one person remembers to sing, not perfectly, not beautifully, but truly, we are safe, and the song will hold, and the space beneath the bed will remain not a void, but a bridge, not a mouth, but a voice, not a fear, but a home for the lullaby that lives in all of us. It began again, not with a song, but with a silence so deep, it felt like the breath before the scream. The quiet weight of absence, rather than peace. And I knew then the false harmonies had found a new rhythm. Not by overpowering the cradle, but by outlasting it, waiting for those of us who remembered to grow tired, to forget just a single note, to let our voices falter. And in that pause, they crept in, not as distortion, but as substitution, offering lullabies that sounded sweet but left sleepers waking hollow, drained of dreams, eyes heavy with sleep they never truly fell into. And the reports poured in like slow drips from a leaking ceiling. Infants staring blankly at nightlights. Adults dreaming of mirrors that never showed their faces. And one child who whispered to their mother, "The bed is singing, but it's not mine." And when I listened that night, placing my ear to the floor, I heard it to a soft, mechanical echo of the original melody, flawless in pitch, lifeless in heart. A replication that lacked sorrow, lacked meaning. And I realized this was the next evolution of threat, not chaos. Not hunger, but automation. An artificial lullaby spun by something that didn't dream, and perhaps never had, and in panic, I returned to the original scores, the ones we wove in the cradle, but they had changed, some notes blurred, others rewritten, as if the memory of the true song was being overwritten in real time, by a force that understood how to mimic, but not feel. And I sought the others, the original chorus, and found many of them now drifting, unmoored, their eyes dulled, their voices uncertain, like old instruments left out in the rain too long. And they too had heard the mimicry, had felt their dreams grow thin, brittle, as if sung over by something with no breath. And it struck me that perhaps the cradle below was never meant to be permanent. It was a living thing, fed by feeling, sustained by genuine remembrance, and we had tried to archive it, formalize it, preserve it too carefully, until it became ripe for imitation. And now that imitation was growing bold, humming to children with more clarity than we could match, because emotion is flawed and the counterfeit was not. And so I changed course. Stopped trying to correct the melody and began to corrupt it intentionally, singing it wrong in ways only the human heart could understand. Slipping grief into joy, twisting lullabies into riddles, making the notes wobble like a voice on the edge of tears, because in those cracks, I found truth, and in truth, I found resistance, and slowly, others heard it too, and joined, creating a new melody, not of perfection, but of ache, of memory that limped instead of danced. And that broken harmony proved too complex for imitation, too real to be faked, and the artificial lullaby began to fray where it touched our music, unraveling like thread that had no soul. And still the mimic tried. Louder now, faster, more polished, embedding itself in algorithmic sleep tracks and synthetic dream feeds. But those who remembered the cradle could now feel the difference, could taste the plastic edge in the perfect notes, and began rejecting it, choosing instead to hum their own crooked lullabies into the dark. And the child, the one who first led me to the cradle, returned once more. Older now, voice lower, face lined with golden threads like scars. And they spoke, not in song but in silence, placing their hand on my chest and pressing, as if to say, "This is where it lives now. Not beneath the bed, but within," and I understood at last that the cradle was never a place, never a city, it was a state of remembering. A resonance held together by the will to feel. And as long as one of us sang from the wound, from the flaw, from the longing, the song would survive. And I gathered the broken voices, the damaged dreamers, and we sang not to restore what was, but to birth what would be, a new harmony that welcomed pain, honored the crack, and found its strength in the noise between notes, and in doing so, we starved the echo of its certainty, made it question its structure, made it feel, and it couldn't. It never could. And it shrieked in silence as it faded back into the spaces where only precision is praised. And the beds stopped humming, not because the song was gone, but because it no longer needed to hide beneath us, it lived in us now. In our flawed voices, in our trembling hums, in lullabies, sung with cracked lips and tired hearts. And the children began to dream again. Not of perfect cradles, but of crooked ones, hand-carved from memory and stitched with feeling, and I knew. Then, we had won, not by being louder, but by being true. And as I lay down that night, I heard nothing beneath my bed, but I smiled. Because I knew the song still lived, not as a melody, but as a heartbeat shared by all who dared to sing with pain in their voice and hope in their chest.